listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with the briefing. Video footage of blackened corpses dragged out of a firestorm, of shattered men and women wailing at the bedside of their injured relatives, and of a man holding the body of a toddler apparently beheaded in an explosion have horrified the world this week. This incredibly traumatic vision showed the aftermath of Israeli airstrikes on a makeshift tent city in Rafah in the south of Gaza. Aid groups said the Israeli Defense Force had designated the area a humanitarian safe zone before launching the attack, although Israel denies this. The Gazan Health Ministry said at least 45 people, including children, were killed and 249 wounded. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the airstrikes were meant to hit a Hamas compound and no civilians were supposed to be hurt. He described the catastrophe as a tragic mishap that would be investigated. Several important things happened in the lead-up to these airstrikes. Hamas fired rockets towards the Israeli city of Tel Aviv. There were no reported injuries or casualties. The International Court of Justice ordered Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah, but it used slightly ambiguous terms. And the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has applied for arrest warrants for Netanyahu, the Israeli defense minister, and 3 Hamas leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But can the law stop the carnage in Gaza right now? And if not, what can it do? Today we speak to international law expert Juliette McIntyre to find out. But first, let's hear from someone who can give us an idea of what really is happening on the ground in Rafah. Frankie Leach is a spokesperson for the humanitarian aid organisation ActionAid, and she joins us now. Frankie, tell us about ActionAid and its work in Rafah.
So ActionAid has partner organisations across the whole of the Gaza Strip. We also have a couple of our staff who are currently based in and around Rafah, and unfortunately our driver narrowly missed the attack on the refugee camp a couple of days ago that happened in western Rafah just by virtue of leaving the area a previous day before.
We've all seen the absolutely horrendous footage out of Rafah over the past 24 and 48 hours. Can you tell us what we know at the moment about what happened in the airstrike?
I can. So a barrage of rockets was launched by Hamas a couple of days ago towards Tel Aviv, which they say was in retaliation to the ongoing attacks and violence by the Israeli Defense Forces in the Gaza Strip. And the Israeli Defense Forces responded by launching 8 very big, powerful missiles back into western Rafah, into what the Israeli government had designated a humanitarian safe zone, which simply means that there were many IDPs, we can also call them refugees in this instance, but displaced people, up to 100,000 in this area alone, sheltering in makeshift refugee camps and tents. Now, the Israeli government says that this morning, their latest kind of statement was that unfortunately one of those rockets hit a fuel tank, which caused the fire. But regardless of whether it was a grave incident, as they say, or an accident, 50 people have died, and a huge area which was sheltering already very desperate and hard done by refugees have lost whatever little they had left of their possessions and a safe place to sleep at night. And as safe, I mean, this I shouldn't say safe because nowhere is safe in Gaza, but at least this was somewhere for them to be able to rest their heads together.
And it must be particularly cruel that this was an area that was designated a humanitarian safe zone.
It is. And I think that there are many NGOs and aid agencies that feel that there is a serious level of distrust now between the international aid community and the Israeli government. We initially saw when people were told to move from north to central Gaza that a humanitarian corridor was set up, which is essentially a road where people could travel safely to escape, and that was bombed by the Israeli forces. So as aid agencies, we're very concerned that if we give coordinates, for example, of where our humanitarian aid operations are, sometimes those coordinates are then bombed, and we can't say that they're targeted for sure, but they're definitely not protected, which is a breach of international humanitarian law. So yes, of course, with this particular incident, it was very upsetting, but this is the norm now in Gaza. And this is why the ICJ put out those provisional measures the other day saying that Israel must immediately halt its offensive in Rafah, because they believe there is a serious lack of care to protect civilian life from the Israeli Defense Forces. And it could not be more of an acute humanitarian crisis in what has now become essentially the largest refugee camp on earth. And, then we're very concerned to see, if we were able to get a ceasefire, which obviously is the main goal, what happens for the future of Gaza, an area that's now been leveled and flattened, and what happens to those people and for those children that grow up without parents or seeing the horror that we've seen in the last 7 months.
Given the killings of the World Central Kitchen aid workers and this latest strike in Rafah and the humanitarian corridor that was bombed, as you mentioned, can humanitarian organisations such as your own continue to operate in these areas? Humanitarian
aid workers don't have much choice. We're not able to do it properly, really, because we're not able to support our operations with the aid that many of our supporters have paid for through fundraising efforts in the last 7 months, because it's been stuck at the border, because not enough diplomatic pressure is being exerted on the Israeli government to get that aid over the border. And, we've seen very horrible footage of settlers, Israeli settlers, attacking that aid. And there was a very terrible news story the other day that suggested that people from within the Israeli army were giving the coordinates and details of where that aid was, leaking it, if you will, to incite attacks from settlers. So, the trust that we've got in the Israeli government is virtually next to none. And I know that I speak for many aid agencies in that.
Frankie Leach from ActionAid there. Now let's turn to the legal side of what's going on. I'm joined by Juliette McIntyre, international law expert from the University of South Australia. Juliette, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has applied for arrest warrants for Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu, his defense minister, and 3 of the top leaders of Hamas. What's the prosecutor accusing them of?
Well, the prosecutor is accusing Netanyahu and Hamas of a series of different war crimes. So we have, actually both of them have been accused of the war crime of extermination. But we also have, for Netanyahu, for example, we have the war crime of starvation, so a deliberately imposed famine against the civilian population.
Israel is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. More than 100 countries, I think, are. But if these arrest warrants are approved by the court, what would have to happen for Benjamin Netanyahu, or for that matter, the leaders of Hamas, to actually be arrested?
Yeah, so what needs to happen is that one of the 124 states parties to the Rome Statute, of whom Australia is one, once there's an arrest warrant issued, they have an obligation to assist the court. So that would be to arrest that person if they came onto their territory, for example, and then to hand them over to the court to see the legal process through. You will see that Netanyahu, if arrest warrants are issued against him as a head of state, would normally travel quite a lot. That's going to be severely impacted. But he will be safe to travel to, for example, the United States, who is also not a party to the Rome Statute.
The prosecutor, when he was announcing these arrest warrant applications, made the point that his office took it to an incredibly high standard before announcing these accusations. How likely is it that you think the court will approve these arrest warrants?
I think in this particular instance, it's quite likely, because I'm sure that the Office of the Prosecutor will have gone to great lengths to ensure the veracity of the evidence that they are relying on. And they've also gone through this process of appointing an independent panel of experts to double check, if you will, what the prosecutor has put forward and whether or not that forms a solid basis for applying for arrest warrants.
We just heard from Frankie Leach about the horrors Israel unleashed on Palestinians sheltering in Rafah just this week. How is Israel publicly justifying its ongoing offensive in Rafah despite the court's judgment?
So if we take it at its highest, Israel says that their actions are in line with military objectives. So they say that, for example, there were Hamas commanders in the area and that the strike was targeted at them, and civilian deaths, while tragic, were sort of an unavoidable fallout. Now, the problem with that is that there are rules about when you're allowed to strike near civilians related to proportionality, related to the expected outcome, and assessing that against any relevant military advantage. It's not adequate to simply say there are terrorists nearby and drop large bombs without any kind of assessment.
So given that is the case, or that's the interpretation, and also given the fact that, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu would have to travel to a signatory state of the ICC in order to actually be arrested, there's a criticism that is around a lot at the moment, which is that all this shows is international law as ineffective, unenforceable, and in practice, what is it actually doing? We've spoken a bit about this off air, but tell me what your response to that is.
My response to that is we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's no question that this is a really hard case that is at the penumbral edges of the effectiveness of international law due to a number of factors. But the law is the law, and the law has been broken, and that is the assertion of the prosecutor, for example, and that's my personal opinion in respect of the ICJ's order. So the law has said what the law can say here, and now it's a question of enforcement, and enforcement comes down to political willpower more than anything else. Courts don't have armies, courts don't have police forces, so courts can do what they can in terms of saying this is what the law is, and we believe that the law has been broken here, but they can't go around enforcing that themselves. They need political actors to do that for them. Just like in a domestic setting, the police force has that role. Here we don't have a police force, so we rely on other states to act cooperatively to ensure that the rules of international law, to which they have agreed, are upheld.
So just because the law is broken doesn't mean that the law doesn't exist. Juliette McIntyre, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you for having me.
Juliette McIntyre there. And that's it for The Briefing today. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow morning. And if you like what we do here, please share this episode with a friend. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.